She had missed only one winter in 31 years, and that was the year everyone believed she had died. Yet the station master insisted that every December, just before the first snowfall, someone still placed a single white rose on the same weathered bench. No one could explain who left it. No one could explain why an old American railroad watch was found there every Christmas Eve, ticking perfectly despite being older than most of the town itself. The answer had been buried for decades inside a promise that should never have survived a war, and by the time anyone understood it, 2 lives had already been shaped by a single sentence spoken in the cold. In the winter of 1976, Anna Weiss stepped onto Platform 3 carrying the same wool coat she had carefully repaired every year since the spring of 1945. The fabric had faded, its cuffs worn smooth by countless winters, but she wore it as though time itself depended on those familiar stitches. Snow drifted gently across the tracks while steam rolled beneath the arriving trains, wrapping the station in a quiet haze. The ticket clerk recognized her immediately. He offered the same gentle smile he had offered every December for nearly 3 decades, and without asking, slid a paper cup of hot coffee across the counter. Anna thanked him softly before taking her usual seat beneath the iron station clock. Around her, travelers hurried home with wrapped gifts and laughing children. But she watched only the tracks disappearing into the white distance, her calm blue eyes fixed on a place where hope had long ago become nothing more than a quiet habit. The station clock chimed 3 slow times before another train eased into the platform, its steel wheels singing softly against frozen rails. Passengers stepped into the swirling snow one after another, wrapped in heavy coats, carrying suitcases, gifts, and the familiar excitement of returning home. Anna watched every face with the same quiet patience she had carried for more than 30 winters. She never hurried. She never leaned forward. Hope, she had learned, was strongest when it remained still. The ticket clerk glanced toward her and sighed almost imperceptibly. He had once asked why she continued to come, but she had answered with nothing more than a gentle smile. Since then, he simply filled her coffee cup each December without expecting conversation. As the platform slowly emptied, Anna lowered her eyes to the old leather gloves resting in her lap. They had never belonged to her. The stitching had begun to loosen, yet she cared for them with extraordinary tenderness, brushing away invisible dust before placing them back inside her handbag. They were the only proof that one winter long ago had truly happened. Outside, another cold wind swept across the station, carrying with it the faint whistle of a departing train. Anna closed her eyes for a brief moment, and somewhere beneath the sound of the rails, she heard a younger voice she had never forgotten. In an instant, the years quietly dissolved, and the winter of 1945 returned as clearly as if it had been waiting beside her all along. March of 1945 arrived without celebration. Winter still lingered across the hills, covering broken rooftops with a quiet blanket of white that softened scars but could not erase them. Anna Weiss carried a small basket through the village each morning, collecting bread from the community kitchen for elderly neighbors who could no longer walk the icy streets. She rarely spoke unless someone greeted her first. Silence had become as familiar as the cold itself. That afternoon, as pale sunlight slipped through heavy clouds, she noticed a lone American soldier sitting beside the stone wall near the abandoned church. His uniform was dusty from weeks of travel, and his shoulders sagged with the unmistakable weight of exhaustion. He was studying a folded map with the careful concentration of someone determined not to ask for help. Anna slowed her steps but did not turn away. After a quiet moment, she pointed toward a narrow road that curved through a grove of leafless trees and led safely into the next village. The soldier looked up with surprised blue eyes before offering a grateful smile. "Thank you," he said slowly, uncertain whether she understood his words. She answered with the smallest nod. Neither of them knew that this simple exchange, lasting less than a minute beneath the fading winter sky, would quietly shape every December that followed for the rest of their lives. The following afternoon, Anna found the same soldier standing beside the village well, carefully refilling his canteen while studying the unfamiliar streets with quiet caution. His name, she would soon learn, was Daniel Harper, a sergeant from Ohio whose calm voice carried none of the hardness she had expected from years of fearful rumors. He thanked her again for showing him the safe road, then unfolded the weathered map one more time. Several village names had become impossible to read after days of rain and travel. Anna hesitated only briefly before tracing a narrow route with her gloved finger, pointing toward an old railway that no longer appeared on newer military charts. Daniel smiled with genuine relief. Before leaving, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pair of brown leather gloves. The stitching along one thumb had come loose, and he laughed softly as he admitted that his mother would have scolded him for never learning to mend them. Anna accepted the gloves without a word and disappeared into her family's small cottage. Less than an hour later she returned, the seam repaired so carefully that it was almost impossible to find. Daniel slipped them back on, flexed his fingers against the cold, and looked at her with quiet admiration. For the first time in many months, both of them smiled without forcing it. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm neither of them had expected. Whenever Daniel's duties brought him through the village, he found one small reason to stop. Sometimes he asked about a road that he already remembered. Sometimes he carried a loaf of fresh bread from the field kitchen, insisting it was more than he could finish alone. Anna always accepted it with quiet gratitude, then divided it among her elderly neighbors before saving the smallest piece for herself. Their conversations remained simple, careful, and unhurried. They spoke about the weather, about the stubborn arrival of spring, about the church bell that still rang every Sunday, even though half the stained glass windows had long since disappeared. One afternoon, Daniel pulled an old railroad watch from his pocket to check the time. The silver case was scratched from years of use, but when he snapped it open, the steady ticking seemed strangely comforting against the silence of the empty square. Anna listened for a moment before smiling. "It is still keeping perfect time," she said softly. Daniel looked at the watch, then at her, and answered with a quiet laugh. "My father always said that if you take care of something, it remembers how to keep going." Neither of them realized those simple words would become the promise both of them carried long after that gentle spring had faded into memory. The morning Daniel received his transfer orders, the village seemed quieter than it had in weeks. Even the wind moved gently through the bare branches as though reluctant to disturb the stillness. He folded the official paper with careful hands and slipped it into his jacket before walking toward the small square where Anna was hanging freshly washed linen beneath the pale spring sun. She noticed his expression before he spoke. There was no surprise in her eyes, only the quiet understanding that difficult news often arrived without warning. Daniel looked toward the distant railway tracks stretching across the countryside before finally breaking the silence. "I leave tomorrow," he said softly. Anna lowered the last clothespin and stood beside him without searching for words that neither of them could honestly offer. After a long moment, Daniel reached into his pocket and held out the old railroad watch. "Keep this until I come back," he said. Anna gently closed his hand around it instead. "No," she whispered. "You will need something that remembers the way home." Daniel smiled faintly, then nodded as though he had expected that answer all along. Before they parted, he looked toward the first cool breeze drifting across the fields and quietly said, "When peace finally feels like winter again, I will return." Anna never asked him to promise twice, because she believed the first promise completely. The first peaceful winter arrived exactly as Daniel had imagined it would. Snow settled quietly across the rooftops, softening every sharp edge the passing years had left behind. On the first Saturday of December, Anna walked to the station wearing the same wool coat and carrying nothing except quiet certainty. She chose the bench beneath the old iron clock because it faced the arriving trains. Every whistle made her lift her eyes. Every passenger stepping onto the platform carried the impossible possibility that promises could outlast distance. The first winter ended without his return. Then came another, and another. The station master changed. New ticket clerks learned her name. Children who once waved at the patient young woman grew into parents bringing children of their own through the station. Some offered sympathetic smiles. Others whispered that she should finally let the past rest. Anna never argued. She simply thanked the clerk for her cup of hot coffee, brushed a few snowflakes from the empty seat beside her, and waited until the last train disappeared beyond the hills. Across the Atlantic, Daniel was also counting winters. Letters he carefully addressed to her village never reached their destination after an administrative error sent them to the wrong district. Months became years, and years slowly became silence. Yet neither of them understood that hope had not failed. It had merely lost its way. In the winter of 1976, the station clock struck 4 as another train rolled gently through falling snow. Anna remained seated beneath the familiar iron beams, her paper cup warming hands that had grown older but never uncertain. The conductor stepped onto the platform, glanced at the waiting passengers, and called the final stop before the doors slowly opened. Families embraced. Friends laughed. Travelers hurried into the evening carrying wrapped packages and heavy coats. Then, almost unnoticed, an elderly American man stepped carefully onto the platform with the help of a polished wooden cane. His silver hair caught the pale afternoon light, and his movements were slower than the confident stride of the young sergeant who had once walked through her village. Anna did not recognize his face at first. Time had quietly rewritten every familiar feature. But as he reached inside his overcoat to check the hour, a soft metallic click drifted through the cold air. The old railroad watch opened with the same unmistakable sound she had heard more than 30 years before. She closed her eyes for only a heartbeat. When she opened them again, tears did not fall. Instead, the smallest smile touched her lips. Across the platform, the old man looked toward the weathered bench beneath the station clock, stopped walking entirely, and whispered her name with the quiet disbelief of someone who had finally arrived exactly where he had always intended to be. Daniel stood motionless for several seconds before crossing the platform with slow, careful steps. Neither of them hurried. Time had already done enough of that for both of them. When they finally stood face to face, there were no grand speeches waiting to be spoken. Anna simply smiled and brushed a single snowflake from the shoulder of his overcoat, just as she had once brushed loose thread from his worn leather gloves. Daniel opened the old railroad watch and held it where they could both hear its steady rhythm. "It never stopped," he said quietly. Anna looked at the familiar silver case and answered with the same calm certainty she had carried through every passing winter. "Neither did I." They spent the rest of the afternoon in the small station cafe, sharing hot coffee while snow gathered outside the windows. They spoke about ordinary things that had become extraordinary simply because they could finally say them together. They laughed about roads that no longer existed, remembered neighbors whose kindness had outlived history, and discovered that silence between old friends needed no explanation. 1 year later, when Anna's familiar seat beneath the station clock remained empty, the ticket clerk placed a single white rose upon the weathered bench before dawn. Not long afterward, an elderly American arrived carrying a polished cane and an old railroad watch. He accepted his usual cup of coffee, sat beside the white rose, and quietly waited until the last train disappeared into the falling snow, proving that the strongest promises are not measured by the years they require, but by the hearts that never stop keeping them.